The Theory of Affordances. There is a danger of reading any tool, any technology, as being either inherently good or inherently bad. That is often referred to as the problem of technological determinism. Technological determinism suggests that these tools or technologies have inherent properties that do not change. One way to question this is through the theory of affordances. Let's take the example of a kitchen knife. Now, a kitchen knife could be a murder weapon. You could kill someone with a kitchen knife. At the same time, you could also chop up your vegetables. Is a kitchen knife then inherently good or evil? This is the question which James Gibson approached and articulated in this book, The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, where he develops this astonishingly rich and interesting theory of affordances. Now, I'm not going to go into this in all its detail. There are many nuanced viewpoints, insights that Gibson offers us. I just want to talk about the primary one, about the notion of affordance itself. The logic of affordance argues that tools themselves have no agency. They cannot force us to do anything. It's up to us. It's a question of what we human beings want to do with these particular tools or technologies. And without wishing to ascribe any agency to these tools, we could possibly say that they afford the possibility of certain operations, by which I mean we are able to do certain things with them. By pulling upon this cord, we're able to switch on the light. Likewise, we have a push pad on a door or a handle on the door that allow us to open doors. They don't force us to open the doors, but they allow us to open the doors. And of course, we have to be aware that some doors may be too stiff to open for someone who is infirm, or the door handle might be too high for a little kid to reach, and so on. So they don't afford these possibilities to everyone. They are dependent on the individual concerned. And we can imagine, for example, in the case of a hammer, that a hammer is particularly useful for hammering in nails. It's been designed for it. That's what we can do very well with a hammer. We can hammer in nails. By contrast, with a screwdriver, we can screw in screws. And we could, to some extent, attempt to hammer in a nail with a screwdriver, but it wouldn't be as good for hammering in nails as a hammer. Equally, we could maybe attempt to screw in a screw using a knife or other such implement, but it wouldn't be as good as a screwdriver. This is the affordance of a screwdriver. We can use it to screw in screws. This has certain implications for architecture, this theory of affordance. If we look back to, let's say, the Victorian era, when they were drawing buildings using parallel motions, we can see how useful a parallel motion was for drawing parallel lines. And we can also see these other set squares on the parallel motion, which could be used to draw vertical lines very accurately, and also to describe forms of curves. These are called French curves. And they used to be very popular. When I was a student at Cambridge, this is how we used to draw curves. But the real problem with these French curves is that we didn't actually know what curve we were drawing. We were making a line on paper, but how do we describe that line? And this, for example, led to a problem with the Sydney Opera House. Jorn Utsen's famous sketch of the billowing vaults, as it were, of the Sydney Opera House could not be described, so the engineers were able to define the structural properties of this vault. And it needed the engineers to reduce these forms to segments of a sphere. So what we now have are effectively not billowing vaults, not free-form billowing vaults, but regular segments of a sphere that allowed the engineers to calculate the structural performance of those vaults. Now that we have software that allows us to describe curves, explicit modeling tools like Maya and Rhino, parametric tools like CATIA, or algorithmic tools using visual icons such as Grasshopper, we are now able to describe very precisely the curves that we want to define. And that allows them to be constructed accurately. It allows them also, if we want to be 3D printed. We can send the file to a 3D printer and start printing these things. And this, to some extent, this possibility of being able to define a curve is what has helped to afford the possibilities of these free-form buildings designed by Zaha Hadid architects and others. We are now able to define very precisely the curves that we make. And not only that, we're also able to adjust them. The principle of the parametric is that you could take one point in a curved line and adjust that point, and the whole curved line would realign itself accordingly. In other words, these new computational softwares have afforded the possibility of producing curvilinear buildings in a way that we were never able to before. By extension, we could also take the theory of affordance and apply it to the use of a building. This is Bedford Square in London, where the Architectural Association is housed. It is also the square in which my publishers Bloomsbury, are located. But it was designed as a square for houses, no doubt with the servants' quarters either in the attic or in the basement, and each one of these were houses initially. And of course, they don't need to be turned into schools of architecture or publishing offices. They could be turned into many other things. Indeed, most of them are actually other forms of offices. But they could be turned into a deeply right-wing building, housing deeply right-wing activities, such as a neo-fascist organization, or indeed into a series of progressive activities, a creche for single mothers. The architecture does not control what the building is used for. On the contrary, the way in which the building is being used is what lends it a certain character. The performances, the rituals that go on in the Architectural Association, the lectures, the seminars, the design reviews, the juries and so on, these are what define the AA, the Architectural Association, as being what it is. The affordances, however, of a building can also affect that. For example, let's take a red telephone box that you find elsewhere all over London. It would be impossible to have a football game being played in a red telephone box because it is simply too small. There are certain limitations for this. And of course, we can remodel the interior of a building, as indeed has happened to some extent at the AA, and allow for another set of activities, a bar, for example, to take place. In other words, the affordance of a building allows it to be used in a certain way, but the building does not define how it should be used. We, the users, are in charge of that. To some extent, then, we can talk not only about a technological determinism, but also an architectural determinism. The limits at the extent to which we can use particular buildings for particular purposes. But the important point to stress is that the building does not dictate how it is to be used. In this respect, I'm highly skeptical of the thinking, for example, of Bruno Latour, the French philosopher. Bruno Latour believes in what he calls the object network theory, which is to say how an object can have some agency in defining how it could be used. We could also use a similar principle to think about capitalism. Is capitalism inherently good or bad? No, it's really a question about how it is being used. So anti-capitalists alongside pro-capitalists, in some sense, are guilty of a form of, let's call it, capitalistic determinism, of saying that capitalism is either inherently good or bad. If we are to make a donation, that is also a form of capitalism. And you can see the irony of this approach, where often in artistic circles there is a huge skepticism of capitalism. Offer them to buy one of their paintings or artworks, and they will be very happy about this. Equally, Kate Crawford, who is one of the critics of AI, despite the fact that she works for Microsoft, engages in what I think is a form of technological determinism by criticizing Jeff Bezos and Amazon. Now, I'm sure there are many things that are wrong with what Jeff Bezos and Amazon do, but if you then sell your book on Amazon, you have to be a little bit skeptical about this situation. In other words, technological determinism is not a very subtle term. We have to engage with the possibility of what Gibson has called the theory of affordances, to understand that any tool, any technology, any system, capitalism or otherwise, any building, does not have any agency. It doesn't force us to operate in a certain way. In and of itself, it is not good or bad. AI is not good or bad. Buildings are not good or bad. Capitalism is not good or bad. In every single case, it's a question of how you use it. How do you use tools? How do you use buildings? And how do you operate with capitalism?